Thank you very much for that. It's just frightening. My question is also a suggestion, and it's this. Obviously, your voices, women's voices, are not being heard. So my question is, why aren't you going and attracting people like Gail Kelly, who's high profile, high visibility, and others like her, such as the other ladies, such as the one who's in the Central Bank, Reserve Bank of Australia. Their voices will carry a lot more weight than yours, and that's no disrespect, but you need someone with heavy voices that get this damn message through to them, that women are being, hate to use the word, screwed.
Good idea. I mean, it's a good idea. I mean, what's difficult though to know, I mean, there has been a huge level of engagement on this issue, and maybe going somewhere senior like that is a consideration. But I think as well, you know, there was 14,000 signatures went to Parliament in a record time of 1 month that were gathered as hard signatures, not electronic signatures. And you know, there's been thousands of letters gone to the Minister from local members, from all sorts of people giving their support, and it hasn't actually. I think they're so determined to implement these reforms that at this point I can't see them overturning the results.
I used to work at a women's refuge, Maryville Women's Refuge, Jean's Place, and now I'm unemployed. I've been without a job for 3 weeks. We all were made redundant. But my question is for Kat. Just before those reforms were going to be announced, we have various big rallies, meetings at the town hall here around the corner. And why did I propose to go publicly and speak out and go to the media? And we knew we were going to lose a lot of the workers or jobs, but at that stage the managers didn't support us, and up to the very last minute we weren't allowed to speak to the media or anyone because our redundancy was not going to be paid.
Did you ask a question?
So the question is, why didn't the managers support us and went publicly before, when we knew there were going to be cuts and big changes?
I think that, you know, there's a lot of questions to be asked throughout this reform in terms of representation from peaks, representation from services. But generally speaking, I mean, I think that a lot of services were kept so busy by the reforms and by running really important services that are crisis services, and trying to also participate in a very complex tender process. I think there was also a lot of fear that if they spoke out they would lose their services, that they would, you know, that could go against them. And I know that a lot of services were directed not to speak out. You know, I don't agree with it, but I think that happened generally across the board, Maria. I think it happened everywhere.
What proportion of experienced people from secular organisations who worked in the field have been replaced by people from faith-based organisations, inexperienced?
It's difficult to tell. What's actually happening is absolutely chaotic and confusing for services. So domestic violence line, for example, which is the primary referrer to women's refuges, they are finding that they are still not getting information about the new services to refer people to, and that when they try to refer to those who are on their list, there's either an answering machine or silence. Within the No Shelter organisation, with the telephone contact list, 35 workers' work phones and work emails are now silent. I understand that at a minimum 17 refuges were closed down in August. Kat may have better information than me on this, and that another 13 are due to close down by the end of October, and 44 by the end of the year. That's what I've been told, but nobody's too sure what's happening. And of the services that are closing down, I don't think that anyone has evaluated the replacement of secular workers with faith-based organisations yet. Probably that information will start to be gathered because it's going to have a huge effect.
I think some of the things you said before as well, Christine, about them bringing in workers to train their inexperienced workers, that's definitely happening. But there are large areas where no existing staff have retained their jobs. So I could give an example of Sydney, what's called the District of Sydney, and which has been run by a faith-based organisation and takes into account about 5 or 6 services, a couple of which are women's refuges. None of those workers retained their job. They brought in all their own staff. They also had no Aboriginal staff. They had no Aboriginal staff at all. I mean, that is a huge issue across the sector, because one of the things of the Women's Refuge movement was a positive employment and representation within the structure previously. And, you know, it's really important for Aboriginal women to see Aboriginal women in services when they come in to get support.
The consultancy reports, you referred to 2 consultancy reports by KPMG that led up to the changes. I wonder, first, were they public? And secondly, do you know what the actual rationale for moving away from women-only services was in detail? Because I have been involved on and off for years in this. I'd be really interested to know what their explicit rationale was, and also how that linked to the need for confidentiality of services, which the others referred to.
The reports, I mean, obviously there were things around efficiencies. So one of the things behind it was, you know, if there's less contracts to manage. So if you go from 336 contracts down to 69, that's cheap.
But they didn't address why not specialist women-only services. I just absolutely think they did not acknowledge it as important. It's been completely undervalued in the whole process, and you couldn't see any evidence of that acknowledgement through, you know, in any. It's been difficult throughout the whole reforms to see any acknowledgement of that, other than in some of the tenders. I worked on some of the tenders. I've also been now involved in some services that have been successful as a transitional consultant with them working towards implementation. And it's very difficult to see in all of the work of, you know, feminist women's organisations being valued at all in any of that process. It's minuscule. Were the consultancy reports?
Yes.
So the link with confidentiality, I can give a lovely example of this, and that is that our medium-term women's refuge has no worker on site, because that's an obligation from the department for allowing us to have that block of units. We, at one point, a few years ago, had an attempt to take over the property management by the large organisation who is successfully tendered in our area. They tried quite a few years ago to take over the property. A battle ensued, which I eventually won. But how I was able to win it is their absolute ignorance, which at that time related to a particular case, and that is that we had to close the program down because a woman had a failure with the family court to recognise that she was in a refuge, and the family court ordered that the husband should be allowed to go and pick the children up from the refuge. Now, this particular husband had a very serious mental health issue. We liaised with the local hospital, the mental health unit at the hospital, because they were having enormous difficulty in managing his medication, and in fact no medication that they tried could prevent his psychotic episodes. And this particular man also happened to have a rifle which he carried with him. So this man with a rifle and unmanaged psychotic episodes, was going down to our block of units to pick up his children for an access visit. No problem with family court with this, and this is a common issue. And we were at that point where it was somewhat advantageous for us to close down the program, try to support the women who were fleeing from the program. Anyway, we approached this very large, very experienced housing service that gets all the awards to say that we wanted to take over property management from them because they refused to give notice to quit to the woman. We needed to get her out. She was totally terrorised and terrified, and there was nothing that she was going to do to antagonise him. They wouldn't give notice to quit because it wasn't on the grounds of her residential tenancies agreement. She was paying the rent. The place was reasonably clean and tidy. And the man who argued with me with utter contempt for anything I had to say said that we will decide who goes in and who leaves, and the only basis for a notice to quit will be if they break the residential tenancies agreement. So the battle ensued, we won it, but that's the kind of thinking of these large generalist community housing organisations.
Charlie Bradley, thanks very much for making me squirm from my gender's shortcomings. It was very powerful. I want to raise some issues of governance. It seems to me that I've heard a great deal tonight about the breakdown between government and the community and its people. There are questions about the trust between the people and the political parties and in government. The aspect of governance I'd like you to say a little bit more about is what on earth have the permanent bureaucrats in the welfare departments, but also in Treasury, have been doing? For example, how were they able to come to these decisions, given their vast experience over more than, going way back, we assume? Why were they able to make such judgmental decisions in such a sensitive area?
There's a couple of issues in that I can possibly I can answer that. That there has been someone who's in charge of, this is a bit frightening having this film, but anyway, that's been in charge of that housing program, Housing New South Wales, that has wanted the money that women's refuges have had for many years. So in my role as EO at the New South Wales Women's Refuge, I was in constant battle with him. And look, there's been a real problem that domestic violence has been subsumed into a homelessness agenda. Domestic violence is, sure, women become homeless, it's part of it, but it's an approach to women and children who are homeless because of domestic violence, an approach to a family who are homeless for a range of other reasons. It's a completely different kind of response and completely different issues. So in some ways we have never been, in a very good partnership, I don't think. We never knew where else to go. There were times thoughts about putting us into a justice response, and then there were concerns about that because we weren't wanted by the minister at the couple of times where we had those opportunities. So some ways it was best the devil you know than the devil you don't. But, in retrospect, baby, who knows? But I know that housing, there's always been a lot of issues around the fact that women have been very effective in this long fight to establish women's refuges, and not without absolute, going without themselves. I mean, as Chris is saying, a lot of them worked for years for nothing. I mean, I think there's one example in 1988 that you can find where women who worked in refuges in New South Wales went from earning $9 an hour, and there were funding cuts and really a big increase in needing services. So the whole sector got together and decided they would accept $3 an hour. Now, who else does that? you know, and that actually went on for a year and a half, so that we didn't have to reduce services to women and kids, so they could continue to receive the services that they want. So this is a sector that has had passion, and you know, and it's been a very connected sector of, you know, very rights-based around women's issues. So it hasn't been about a job that you go to. It hasn't been about that at all. And I think that one of the things that at different times and with different opportunities, these services did get more money than some of the other services. So they were well funded because of the, you know, things that happened over different times. So there's been a lot of issues in the homeless sector about the funding levels sometimes of women's refuges, but not really any understanding of what it takes to run a 24-hour service, the confidentiality issues, the safety issues, the long work that has to go on for years after a woman comes in if she needs to go through family law. So this has been tried to have been attacked on a number of times over a number of years. I can think of 2 times where we successfully stopped it in the 9 years where I was there, where they were ready to slip the money into that housing was going to take over rather than community services. And you know, there was a person that worked in there, come hell or high water, before he went out the door. In my view, that's what he wanted to see happen. And you know, that also solved a whole lot of issues around they don't need to put extra money into homeless. They can actually rip some of the budget off women's services and put them into generalist services. So I think it's a couple of things. One, they never really got the problems of domestic violence homeless services sitting within a homeless program, because in some ways it didn't really belong there. There were extra things that should have been really considered and valued about it, and that did not happen in this process. And I think that didn't happen in this process on purpose.
I would just add to that, and totally agree with that, but I would also add that it's part of a series of changes that are occurring within community services, welfare services, and that is the high valuation of the corporate approach. You do very well if you're a large organisation with good mates and a good corporate structure, and the bigger they are, the bigger they get, because they have people who devote their time and energies to writing tenders and funding applications, and they have, you know, public relations events that they invite their mates to. So organisations that prioritise what it is we're doing for disadvantaged people, it's the Russian doctor effect too, which is in Russia, doctors had very high status until large numbers of women became doctors, and then their status plummeted. So if you work with the things that this society finds difficult to confront, and you work with people who this society doesn't value particularly highly, you are viewed in the same light.
I just wanted to make, I guess, one quick statement and a question. And the statement is about the youth homelessness sector and some of the disappointment that even some of the winners of the tenders have found, because even for the winning organisations, they've found the actual number of beds reduced, and the idea of case management, the number of case managers being increased. So the idea is that somehow you can manage your way out of youth homelessness, presumably sending them back home, you know. So that was just a statement. But the question was, what effect do you think the men's rights movement has had on this sort of decision?
And it's interesting because it's actually different from what's happened in the UK, where this whole process was driven by the effect of the men's rights movement, which positioned women's refuges as outdated and also as vaguely discriminatory, and it had a very strong push to try to raise the figures of men affected by domestic violence, to say that, you know, men need refuges too, It attacked women's refuges that were sort of struggling to get by on the little amount of funding that they had. So that found weaknesses within the sector itself because it was so underfunded and struggling. The argument they put is that this focus on women's refuges is outmoded, discriminatory, no longer necessary, that domestic violence can affect anyone and it can affect men, and so therefore we should have mixed gender services. That really hasn't sort of hit here yet, but I expect that it will, and fairly soon perhaps.
You've been talking about the government without mentioning the Minister for Women. Where do they sit in this? No, I mean the New South Wales Minister.
Yeah. The Minister for Women is Prue Gowd, and was very involved in because previous to her planning portfolio, she was actually the Family and Community Services Minister, which is now held by Gabrielle Upton. So she was part of the whole architecture of these reforms. So we had the Minister for Women, who also was holding the New South Wales domestic violence plan. It stops here, and at the same time doing this. In fact, I had a meeting with a woman who was head of the Office of Women at the time when the plan was about to be announced, and I had a meeting with her on an issue around child protection that I'd been trying to push for a number of years. And I said to her at that meeting, are you aware that this is what's happening with women's refuges, and it looks like with what the number of tenders that are going out that there'll be a huge reduction, because part of the It Stops Here plan was also reliant on the infrastructure of women's refuges. Now, interestingly, the head of the officer had absolutely not heard a thing, yet they are in the same building. They have the minister who's looking after both portfolios. It was actually kept completely silent on purpose. She has since left that position, I would imagine, out of the situation being impossible. Because, one thing to realise, in every community, a women's refuge is actually part of systems improvement. It's actually been part of what's driven police to respond in a certain way, courts to work in a certain way, doctors to work in a certain way, preschools to respond, schools to respond. Everything around domestic violence in a community, usually the key driver behind that has been women's refuges. So without that in our community, we're not even thinking yet what that's going to mean. Because really, a lot of the time it's been women's refuges that have held those systems to account. So they've been the ones at meetings when something outrageous has happened around a woman's safety, or there's been a death, or there's been a woman really badly beaten that shouldn't have been because there's been an order and all sorts of information in place that should have protected. They've been the ones holding that system to account. Now, whether I cannot imagine in my wildest dreams, having met some of these faith-based organisations, that they are going to sit there and do the really gutsy work that women's refuge workers have done. It's not going to happen. So actually, systemically, across this state, we're going to see a real watering down of responses, in my view.
Could you please put your hands together to thank our wonderful